Thank you for the fun title you gave my session today. So these are Eric's words, but who am I to change them? It's kind of fun. And, well, Eric's good at marketing, so thank you, Eric. And this is me. So yeah, I've been using VMware for about a decade. As Eric just mentioned, he and I are using a server in common. And I feel like, well, we're sitting on kind of a pretty cool secret. The Intel Nooks of the world and lots of other servers tend to get a lot of attention, but here we finally have a machine that's suitable for home lab use. So I'll be clear that, yeah, I've got a website. I've had it for 5 years and yeah, my day job is at IBM, but today I'm here as an IT pro. Really nothing to do with my day job, more to do with my tinkering evenings and weekends with servers that bring a lot of that server or data center infrastructure to your home finally in an efficient and sensible way that we can, afford to run. And as you'll soon see, travel around with a bit. So here's a little fun slide just thanking you again, Eric, for some parts. Eric built the biggest, baddest Supermicro SuperServer in the world, doubling the memory that I had the ability to afford at the time, and jammed it full of the best premium storage. So what you're looking at on the right there is Eric's machine as I'm about to fly to Miami. And just good times, and having multiple servers made over a dozen articles that I've written possible because of Eric's generosity. So thank you again, Eric, for all that. All right, and then someone else on the left excited about their home lab. So in the last 2 weeks alone, Eric seems to have found 5 new people who just bought these and are rather excited. So, okay, stepping back in time for a moment. April 2011, when I started my website and started blogging about RAID controllers. So that thick red cable bundle in the middle, you might recognize, LSI RAID controllers and those thick cables and a whole lot of drives. It feels kind of insane to me as I look back at that. And that was much more efficient than any dual Xeon I repurposed or took home from work from a junk pile of 4 or 5 year old machines. Those burned 400 or 500 watts. So as crazy as this looks, it was still more efficient. But this is today. So now we got April 2011, Core i7. That's the first one I showed you, the huge thing. 32 gig of RAM. All these years, couldn't really break past that affordably. There were a few handful of machines, 64 gig, but they had 8 slots. They used a lot of electricity. So here's my win here. I'm going to not spend a lot of time on screens like this. I'm going to spend much more time on actual live demo. So bear with me with just a few more PowerPoint pages, and then you can refer to these later, of course. We'll get into the live demo. But why did I highlight $260 per year? Well, think of that. I've been running that for 4 years. So I've blown $1,000 of electricity in 4 years. That's the way you need to think about your home server, especially if you leave it running 24/7 like I do, so I can quickly spin up a VM at a moment's notice. Booting VMware or Hyper-V or pretty much any server OS is going to take a while. Discouraging use. It's a whole lot better if you could just leave it running at a modest $80 a year. I'd much rather spend the, considerable savings over a 4-year span on things like SSDs rather than just my electric company. And I live here in Connecticut where it's pretty expensive in New England for electricity. All right. And then all that's happened since June of 2015 is a slight revision to the Xeon. 5% speed boost, big deal. So really, this is a many-year effort where Intel boiled down all the stuff people really want in a server and put it on a system on a chip. We're going to have some pictures coming up. This is the picture coming up. That it's the motherboard. So what's special about this picture? Well, it's tiny. You're looking at a 50 millimeter fan. You're looking at full-size memory DIMMs that take up almost the full length of the motherboard. So it's 6.7 inches. Crazy small. But what it's not lacking is interfaces. So if you like Hyper-V or VMware or SUSE or Red Hat or Citrix, you tend to like network ports. So the cool news is here, I'm going to point with the mouse, is actually I'm not sure if webinars show the mouse cursor, but at the left you see an RJ45. Fine, you put your Cat 5e or Cat 6 gigabit cable in there, that's your management. And when I remotely control the server that I'm going to show you, it's going to be through that dedicated managed port over on the left. But there's still 4 more ports there, and 2 of them are 10 gig, which is kind of freaking awesome, especially if you're thinking about vSAN or other forward-thinking things. So I think if you bought something today like a Nook and it's limited to 32 gig of RAM, that's the very latest Nook, most were 16, like the Mac Minis before, I think it's going to feel really old in 2 or 3 years. So I'm happy I waited for a machine that goes all the way to 120 gig of RAM. There's the big number. bullet 2 on this list. So I try to capture all the highlights here of why this is an interesting server. It might not look like much. It's a pretty modest mini tower design, all of 12 inches deep, 10 inches high, 7 inches wide, and 15 pounds in the box that ships to your curb. So just modest and quiet enough and not putting out a lot of heat. The cool thing is what it packs inside. So System on a Chip is kind of the sleeper news of 2015, where it just doesn't seem a lot of people know that all of that jammed on one little motherboard, getting rid of old junk like serial ports, parallel ports, RAID controllers that tend to burn a lot of electricity and use a lot of room. That's gone. This is just 6 full-speed SATA 3 ports. So you can do 6 drives, traditional SATA 3 drives, 3.5 or 2.5, and 2 2.5-inch drives. So they can be SSDs. And then finally 2 more NVMe drives. That's 8 total. So in this tiny little compact chassis, you can jam 8 drives in there. And NVMe is stunningly fast, and we'll get into that a little bit. So that's it for the hardware. Challenges, there were some pretty big ones, some black eyes. This is a major product release. So if you've heard about Sandy Bridge from Intel getting a bit of a black eye in the industry for Surface Book and Surface, Microsoft Surface Pro 4 with some issues with connected standby. Well, okay, Xeon D was something that's been brewing for years in Intel's development labs, and when it finally came out last year, it did have some minor release issues. BIOS upgrades fixed them, so that's cool. And a driver from Intel who was dragging their heels working with VMware on making a 10 gig driver. Well, that finally got resolved. So you can imagine as sales started in June, when they started shipping late June, early July of last year, a lot of people were like, well, why would I buy this server with 10 gig interfaces when I plan to put VMware on there and I really need a driver? So that got fixed by November. So I feel good about talking today in this time frame where these major milestones, 1, 2, 3, are all now cleared. These are significant hurdles, and the last one's the biggest, VMware HCL. This is the first mini tower form factor on VMware's hardware compatibility list. So if you use VMware for virtualization, even if you're nesting other hypervisors under it, Linux KVM or even Hyper-V, all that can be nested under ESXi as your main hypervisor installed. Pretty nice to know you actually have support from VMware if you need it. It's actually a legit platform, unlike a Mac Mini or Intel NUC and so forth. So exciting times for the Xeon D. This isn't so much a Supermicro statement I'm making. There's many other brands. The one that happens to be in the form factor that makes most sense for a home happens to be Supermicro, which is a brand that VMware enthusiasts have kind of leaned towards for years anyway. A good 20% cheaper than HP and Dell generally, and Lenovo, and which makes it a good match for home. Okay. Of course, running a business as well will be just fine. That's what these are really supposedly intended for. Now, NVMe, game changer. Everyone throws that word around loosely, but I'm a storage guy who really wanted fast storage at home affordably. This is not a big deal. Yes, you're paying a third more, but your speed, 4 or 5 times quicker, that got my attention. These are not false benchmarks or difficult to do. Eric and his machine or me on my machine, I just run ATTO dispatch, I get the screenshot on the right. That's how fast this thing goes. Not hard to do. Basically just works out of the box with latest versions of Windows and Red Hat and SUSE. You can boot from NVMe. So NVMe was a new phrase for most folks last year. This year it's pretty darn mainstream and quite mature. And this picture up at top tries to show you why it's so darn fast, because we're done with SATA and SAS. Who needs these software layers when NVMe does away with them? So it jettisons SATA compatibility for a much faster future that has lower latency and way better throughput. 540 is the spec you would read on any SSD you bought in the last 2 years. Got kind of silly. It couldn't break past it because SATA 3 was slowing it down. All right, so this particular motherboard has something called PCIe 3 by 4 lanes, and that's critical to get the full speed out of NVMe. So if you bought a motherboard 2 years ago and it has this little M.2 slot in the motherboard, looks like a gum stick. It's about the size of a gum stick. Might not get the full speed unless it's like 2015 Skylake or Xeon D or later. Xeon E and other platforms that are more expensive don't have this yet, by the way. So we're right here in the bleeding edge. And as Eric said a couple of screenshots ago, he and I were first in world trying this stuff and blogging about it. It was quite fun last summer. So yeah, that's the other sleeper thing of last year. You would expect performance sleep like that to be very pricey, and the good news is it just isn't. Sure, it costs a third more. All right, and I've written some articles about storage and what I'm doing, and I got a lot of logos up there. So I can stick a lot of hard drives in there. They're pretty efficient these days. Most of the time they're idle, so they're not burning their 4 to 8 watts anyway. Now the roles for this audience, more long end user computer, VDI, Citrix, Zen. Now, discrete GPUs, I'm not going to get into that too much today other than to say, yes, this motherboard can pass through devices, but things like $2,000 NVIDIA grid cards, no, not so much. Those are full height, double width. You need another server and another motherboard, frankly. Xeon D would not be a great match for that. You're going to need a big, beefy power supply and be prepared to burn 300 watts. So that's not the target for this, just being honest. So that would be, the drawbacks. The highlights, though, here, lots of RAM, lots of CPU cores, double, all but the $1,200 Core i7. So when you hear about someone getting a Skylake Gamer box, they have 4 cores. This Xeon D has 8. So it's getting more work done in less clock cycles, with less gigahertz and less heat. Generally about half of what a Skylake's going to use. And then finally, fast storage, we already talked about. Next screen. Demo time. Like I said, wasn't going to spend a whole lot of time presenting PowerPoint to you. I really want to get into hitting all the bullets in this demo. First one is really explanatory and summarizing what I already said. That boot from NVMe. You set your BIOS to UEFI mode and you're done. And that's how they ship if you buy from where Eric and I buy them, from a place called Wired Zone. So you turn it on, you can install Windows or SUSE or Red Hat or Windows Server. It'll just work and it'll boot fine if you install it right onto a consumer-priced $320 Samsung 950 Pro. And when you reboot, it won't blue screen or anything. It's just it'll just work. So modern OSs handle all of that just fine with ridiculous speeds. Okay, next, bullet B. Briefly demo each one of the following features, and then I go through IPMI and BIOS. So I'm going to break out and do that. So I happen to have Firefox running here. And if you've never used Supermicro, well, if you've been a sysadmin of Dell or HP gear, or ILO, you're probably most familiar with, or IBM will get RSA adapters. So whatever you want to call it, some sort of remote administration. And it's going to tend to include the ability to remotely control and see the OS. So obviously I have ESXi 6.0 update 2 running on my SuperServer. This particular one has 2 sticks of memory. I had to mail back a loaner machine of 128 gig minutes ago. UPS picked that one up. But I'll have more machines soon. So anyhow, this is my machine that I bought last summer and kind of prototyped for the rest of the world, kind of a build that's ESXi ready. And I can mount files. I can mount an ISO. So why would I run over to the server, whether it's lights out in a data center or tucked in a corner of your basement so your family doesn't hear or see your server? All you need is power and Cat5e or Cat6, 1 gig or 10 gig rated cabling. That's it. You don't need a keyboard, monitor, mouse to be near the server. So that's one of the beloved features of having a Supermicro or a real server rather than just a Core i7, and Intel NUC or the like, which are cheaper, but you don't get this feature. You don't have full remote control and the ability to just remotely mount media like an ISO to make installing ESXi or Hyper-V just trivial. You just mount the ISO and reboot it, and you're good to go. There's a whole lot more to this IPMI interface, which Supermicro's variant they call iKVM. There's a lot about health or sensor readings. So here we can see the temperature of CPU. And right now we're at 40 Celsius. And, it's pretty much idle. And then you can see all the memory dims and all. Fine, what would you do with this? Well, this has nothing to do with an operating system running on the server. This is where you can set up thresholds and alerts and make my phone go off if the temperature gets high or a fan fails and whatnot. So all sorts of rich functionality that has nothing to do with the machine being on or off. It's called IPMI, and you can just kind of get into the server and set up all sorts of monitoring. There's a whole lot of settings in here with no time to cover all of them today for sure. But that's the gist of server health monitoring Now let's move on to the next piece, which is me mentioning that this whole interface here, there's actually an app available on iOS and Android called IPMI View that lets you monitor your machine. So if you have a VPN tunnel to your home and you're out of your home, you can see the temperatures and thermals and everything about the machine and even power cycle it. It's kind of a big deal because can't do that through remote desktop protocol, right? We got the actual server, the physical box can be brought up and down gracefully. Okay, so we're kind of done with the little view on Firefox. Now I'm going to head over to the Java app again. And I'll just mention if we were to power cycle, we can see the BIOS. Hit F1, hit delete at boot, and go ahead and change boot order and so forth. And near the end of this demo, I'm going to boot this ESXi host right over to Windows 10 to see me selecting a different hard drive to boot off of. Right now I'm booted off of a thumb drive, a USB drive sticking out the front of the little tiny SuperServer. Okay. Now, temperature and fan noise. I'll be covering that a little bit too. If we run a benchmark or abuse the CPU, sure, it'll get a little bit warmer. And I've actually done some work on fan noise recently too. I'm going to show you another browser window here. So on my home page, messing around with fans, two $10 fans basically make it much quieter. So about 20 minutes of screwdriver work, you put these two fans in here. Each is under 20. And the thing is like 1/3 as quiet as it is from the factory. It's not bad already, but you can make it very quiet, which is delightful. And especially if you have a lot of hard drives and stuff, you do want to keep air moving through the chassis. It's nice to have a big fan in the back that moves air quietly. So I'll have future articles coming up, including walkthrough videos on exactly how to do that. Now, ESXi system health. So one of the things you want is a stable machine that just runs for days, months, years, stably. It's nice to have this interface, but your local interface of VMware doesn't do you much good. It's not really like Hyper-V with GUI. You don't really do much of anything with the local interface. You just set the IP address and walk away. So what are the interfaces for vSphere? Well, we've got this one. This is called vSphere Client. Also heard it's C#. It's a Windows app. And this has been around for over a decade. So we log in, we point to our host. You can see I've clicked on health apparently, and it looks like I expanded the section showing you here's voltage, fan speeds, and all that. So you're getting a live view of the health of the machine. Now, in the past, you could buy any old motherboard that happened to actually let you install VMware and hope it had network drivers that work. And this one, does, obviously. But you often didn't get health stuff unless you actually installed sim VIBs or driver bundles. You had to do stuff. So being on the VMware hardware compatibility list has its perks, and this would be one of them. You just install VMware and you're good to go. The ESXi hypervisor knows if the machine is healthy or not. And of course, Windows Server 2012, R2, and I've even tried with 2016 Tech Preview 4, and this stuff works fine. Monitoring the health of the system. So if you're trying to actually run a production workload, well, rather important to know if things are healthy and to gracefully shut down if they're not. Okay, that's UI number one. Now, if you've also used VMware, recently they've been pushing us all to vSphere Web Client. And this is how vSphere Web Client looks. I've pointed Chrome, made a shortcut with no URL at the top and no bookmarks to distract you. It looks kind of like a Windows 32-bit app. But it's a little sluggish. And you can see that as I'm painting the screen. We can still see the fan speeds and all that good stuff. It's just a different view. There's a summary view. Okay, so that's what we've been using the last 1, 2, maybe 3 years if you're unlucky. And on 6, the performance got better, but still not great. Now, I am running these appliances, these things I'm pointing my browser to have a nice fast data center. Here you can see the VMs, all of them running. I'm using all that on an SSD. So when you have a home lab and you're tinkering and whatnot, you might think performance doesn't matter, but if every time you go and click on these elements or clone a virtual machine or spin up a new VM, and it's slow, you get kind of annoyed. And once you're on SSD, it's really spoils you. So I tend to not use NASs or spinning drives for much of anything other than backups at this point, because I've gotten so spoiled by the speed of NVMe SSDs. In fact, anything in your SAN or your corporate enterprise world is going to tend to be much slower than this as well. So let's move along to their future UIs, and then we'll touch back to hardware and boot on over to a different OS. All right, back to my Windows 10 desktop. Now let's head on over to Chrome. Okay, big news. 2 weeks ago, ESXi 6.0 Update 2 came out. Okay, but what if you don't have a license or using the free version? Well, for the first time ever, after a decade of people whining about it, you can now just use a browser, and you don't have to be on a PC. And it doesn't rely on Adobe Flash. So it's called ESXi Host Client. And we're about to log into it, and this now comes bundled with ESXi 6.0 Update 2. So people are pretty excited about that, and it's beta. And you're seeing a little error there. I'll hit reload, and it'll probably be just fine. But it's interesting that this is their future, going with web UIs that work from a Mac, as many VMware employees happen to have, or Linux, say. And they use a combination of JavaScript and HTML5. And it's a whole lot snappier. So here I go to manage, and like I promised, I want to find hardware monitoring, and here we are. ESXi Host Client lets me have a look at hardware as well. That's where you can do GPU pass-through, which I mentioned earlier. If you add a PCI device to the server, you can say, hey, I want to pass it through to a VM. Okay. Finally, 3 days ago or so, a whole nother interface came out. This is nice if you're managing only one ESXi host. What if your home lab or your work has 2, 3, 4, however many hosts? Well, a few days ago, the big news was they dropped this beta on the world. vSphere Web Client, it's called. So you're now looking at the future UI for VMware administrators. And that's just, again, kind of big news here. That surprised, I think, a lot of people. We knew it was coming, but there it was, March 29th. And I already got it going on my home lab. It's got some bugs I found, too, about an hour ago, but it's fine. So when I say bugs, I mean, we're talking about UI stuff or the reload you saw. That's not serious. That had nothing to do with the stability of the VMs. VMware's been good at that. And 6.0 in the 14, 15 months has gotten stable and good at handling backups and some of the more serious flaws they had in that first kind of bumpy year. So my videos and focus going forward with projects with the SuperServer tend to be around using NVMe storage and using 10 gig interfaces. So if you have two servers, you can really leverage that. So whether it's Citrix or Red Hat or whatever you do, if you're trying to move data among machines, pretty nice to have a 10 gig interface. And you don't necessarily need to buy a $600 10 gig switch with annoying tiny small fans that spin at high RPMs. These days you can actually just pick up a Cat7 cable, connect it directly between the two super servers, and you have auto crossover happening. If you only have two hosts, that is an option. So again, keeping a home lab affordable, that's a whole lot more intriguing than some articles you may have seen written about people doing crazy things with InfiniBand and trying to buy used parts on eBay with full height PCI cards that burn some watts. So having a 10 gig interface at home, as crazy as it sounds today, I think 2-3 years from now, it'll start to seem nuts not to have it, as that starts to show up even on client platforms. Okay. Back to my presentation here. And where am I at the bullets? Well, I showed you all the UIs, and I mentioned, hey, I'm going to reboot over to Windows, and then show you a couple more things and add some closing thoughts. So it is time to do that, and I want to leave ample time at the end for Q&A. So how am I going to show you me rebooting to Windows? Well, I left this Java applet running, right? And they are moving HTML5, so Supermicro has announced a month ago, yeah, we're moving HTML5 too. And I can't quite, I've got a low resolution going here so you guys can see what's going on better in a web meeting. There you go, you can see that well enough. So now restarting my host. My physical Supermicro server is now going to reboot. Part of that process is gracefully shutting down VMs. And one of my articles that's been very popular for 3 years now is how to buy a cyber power UPS to shut down your home data center. The UPS starts at only like 140 bucks. USB cable goes to ESXi. You lose power in your home and it gracefully shuts down all your VMs and then the ESXi server itself, which is awesome. So that's one of those things where if you have a home lab and you really have no interest in corrupting data or losing it just because of a power outage, that problem has been solved much cheaper than competitors where they tend to want you to have an expensive add-in card. So it's the kind of stuff I love blogging about, is saving people some money and a solution that is quite effective. An example of one of those stories would be just yesterday. $250 at your local Best Buy, Amazon, or Newegg. You break open the enclosure and you've now saved yourself $90 over buying the internal drive. Stuff like that. $250 getting you an 8 terabyte drive, right? So, and as the machine reboots, I'll just show you. This article is also kind of useful if you're kind of thinking, what would I do with those drives? So Eric has one of these, Intel 750s. They do better in a multi-user environment with sustained I/O on them, and that large aluminum heatsink does a great job dissipating heat. These little gumstick M.2s, unless your fan's on a little higher, which is not a big deal, they can warm up a little and they'll start to throttle. So, Intel's very enterprisey, but it also costs more. So this article kind of covers storage options for you in this server and what kind of speeds you can expect and what I'm doing in my home. NAS would be, the lowest, slowest here. Okay, that host is still rebooting because, again, I think I had 4 VMs, including a SUSE and other stuff going on, and it's taking the time to gracefully shut down those VMs before we see the BIOS boot screen where I'm going to hit a key to say, hey, I don't want to boot from USB ESXi hypervisor this time. I want to boot on over to Windows 10. Nutanix CE Community Edition is another Linux-based appliance that actually runs. I've tested that. And as I mentioned before, Red Hat, SUSE, and more. At the end, during Q&A, I hope lots of people will unmute their mics. And we can talk with Eric as well a little bit about what he's done in his home. You heard Eric mention earlier doing some speed testing as well to look where his bottlenecks were. And that was with login VSI. Okay, so you're looking at my BIOS. Let me remove distractions and clutter from the background. Okay, it's telling me BEMC. What the heck is that? That's when you first buy the machine, even if there's no OS, you just point your browser to that IP, and boom, you're able to run this Java applet. So basically, when you first turn the machine with a locally attached, if you have a locally attached video, it'll tell you the IP address to get in. Okay, I'm hitting F2. Sorry, delete. What I really should have hit is F11. Excuse me. All right, I missed it because I was busy talking. So I'm resetting the power again. It wanted to reload ESXi. So I need to be ready to hit F11. So every brand is different, but this particular machine, you hit F11, it'll let me select for this one boot only an alternative storage device. And in my case, that's going to be the Windows 10 instance on the gumstick storage I showed you earlier. And once we get Windows 10 going, some folks have bought what's called a Bundle 1, which has a GPU where you can have 3 4K displays in this little tiny server that has only a half-height video PCI slot. So half-height's not a big deal anymore. You can fit enough GPU grunt using only 40 to 60 watts, outputting 3 video displays. Not so relevant for the VMware world unless you're passing video through. More relevant if you're making this into a workstation that you leave running 24/7 for some high-end grunt with lots of CPU cores. Traditional, workstation use. So now you'll see it's booting Windows 10. And this has nothing to do with remote desktop. You're looking at the native video of the machine. In fact, I've got the video cranked up a little high for a webinar. Let me move it down to something where it fits more comfortably all on your screens there. There we go. So you're looking at a Windows within a window. My laptop is controlling my SuperServer that's natively booted to Windows 10 now. Now, some interesting things happen here too. Remember I mentioned a USB cable attached to a CyberPower? Well, they have some software, and now you're seeing how many watts live I'm burning doing this demo as Windows finishes booting and is starting to settle down to somewhere under 50 watts. Mind you, I have an 8 terabyte drive that just arrived yesterday that I've shoved in there. And this machine is now actually at in the 30s sometimes when it's idling. So, yeah, I'm not kidding when I say it's efficient. Now, a little more fun to abuse it. And this is what I do to make sure when I trust a product. Oops. Okay, let's log in. Don't really need two of those windows open. There we go. So part of my process of trusting a product would be, okay, let's see how many watts it burns. Let's see how hot the CPU gets when I beat on that machine. Something that will do a great job with that. Prime. Uh-oh. All right, I'm getting calls. I need to pause. It looks like maybe the video has a problem.